curriculum were the reason for failure amongst Puerto Rican students. Again, 1980. Could I work with them in building the case against educational linguistic colonialism and for decolonizing language and educational practice, he asked me. Of course, I said yes. This case and many others that followed with the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, with META, a legal advocacy organization, and the NAACP Education Legal Defense Fund, along with Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Haitian and other communities and students of color, helped me see how systemic racism works in both the US legal system and US schools. But it also made me think about how race, along with gender, language, knowledge, and existence-based ways of being in the world, are constitutive parts of what we refer to in this book as the colonial matrix of power. Confronting the operation of this matrix was part and parcel of my praxis with communities and in the institutions we call schools, up until I migrated south in the mid-1990s. Well, it was only later that I began to use the terms coloniality and decoloniality, the concrete experience for me of working against systemic oppressions with communities of color and for a radically distinct educational practice for almost 2 decades in the US, is a foundational part of my history or herstory, of my beginning to learn, to unlearn, in order to relearn, and of what I understand and describe in the book as decolonial praxis. The years spent working collaboratively with Paulo Freire and with the network of critical pedagogy in the US were also crucial in giving me ways to understand the political significance of pedagogy. Pedagogy not necessarily in the context of schools per se, but in the context of social struggle, and also the idea of praxis. So that takes me to my second point. In 1995, I immigrated from the north to the south, from the US to Ecuador. Although my relationship with Ecuador began in the late 1970s, for the past 25 years, Ecuador has been my home, my place of existence, thought, work, and praxis-based struggle. Here, my herstory has taken somewhat different but related paths. While there are certainly parallels with the ongoing struggles in the US, and certainly in other places in the world, against systemic racism and settler colonialism, and the obvious relationship between the two, the differences of territory and collective memory are also great in this part of the world, in Latin America, or what some prefer to call Abayala. 500 plus years after the colonial matrix of power took form here, and then began its global travel, coloniality with its ongoing mutations, reconfigurations, continues to mark most all aspects of existence. Here in Ecuador, I have learned that decolonial struggles are struggles of and for existence and life. While Aníbal Quijano gave me the words and structural arguments to understand and name this reality, social movements have taught me about the lived nature of their significance, including and most especially about the decolonial for, and about the necessary insurgencies of decolonial prospect, praxis, and project. Even before I made my permanent move, Ecuador's indigenous movement, recognized in the 1990s as the strongest in the Americas and possibly the world, approached me, giving me tasks or charges or responsibilities to assume, one of which was to help think an indigenous university. Another from the mid-90s on was to think with the movement's concepts and principles of plurinationality and interculturality, including with respect to knowledge and the rethinking of state. Concepts thought from social movement practice and not from academia. Putting the indigenous movement's decolonial, political, and epistemic project something that they referred to as their political and epistemic project and practice, including in my university work, was part of my charge, part of the task that they gave me. In 1999, the country's Black movement insisted that they too had charges or tasks for me to take on. So began a very different process of shared work, including the formation of what Bassi mentioned of the Afro-Andean Documentary and Oral History Project, the largest living archive of Black collective memory in Latin America. With both movements and their community base, I was pushed to unlearn and relearn. And I keep emphasizing this because I think this is an important part of what the decolonial means. To confront what I thought I knew, and to deeply question the supposedly universal nature of Western being and thought. Decoloniality came to mean for me the praxistic and never-ending work of my own decolonization, as well as the ongoing political, epistemic, and existence-based pedagogies and methodologies of movements, collectives, and communities to not just resist, but more crucially, to re-exist. Decoloniality's significance and sense, again for me, became intricately tied up with the question of the hows. That is, with the action, the labor, the struggle-based work, the pedagogies as methodologies and methodologies as pedagogies of decolonizing. It came to signify and mark a politics of responsibility and ethics, a thinking from and with rather than studying about, and a praxis, including most especially in the university, that works to fissure or crack the white, Eurocentric, westernized, and disciplined frames of knowledge and higher education. The doctoral program that I began 20 years ago, and in which Walter has been a crucial part, is one example of this cracking. It's a crack within the university. For me, it's this politics and praxis that drive my thinking, my doing, including my writing, including in this book, a politics of as praxis, as if it was one word. That, again, for me, is aimed at the crack making and in shifting the gaze away from coloniality's totality and toward its fissures or cracks, increasingly present in Latin America or Abayala, but also throughout the world, including in the United States. What does and could it mean, I ask, to think from and with the cracks, what we might refer to as a kind of crack thinking? This takes me to my third and last point, which has to do with these present times of virus and pandemics in plural, but also with the cracks. I share many of the suspicions about the orchestration of a well-planned global project. I prefer the word project rather than conspiracy. Yeah. Project in which COVID is both strategy and instrument in the new configurations and mutations of capital and the colonial matrix of power. Capitalism and coloniality are not affected by the virus, but feed off of it. In the case of Latin America, but certainly not just here, what is at work is what I understand in part through ongoing conversations with numerous collectives and communities, as a project plan of what I call targeted de-existence. Targeted understood as racialized, gendered, heteronormative, territorialized, and generation. And part of the strategies of extermination, access, and social control, in reality of existence itself, that intend to eliminate all those who hinder, disturb, or are simply not useful to the reconfiguring system of power. Here, COVID is a tenacious, effective, and useful tool. The Amazon is a particularly clear case in point. Since COVID began, the destruction of the Amazon forest has increased by more than 60%. While set fires, massive deforestation, and the uncontrolled advance of state-sanctioned extractive industries of mining, oil, and agro-industry, among others, are eliminating the flora and fauna and the lungs of global life. Military, state-sanctioned military, protect the rights and access of companies and workers to enter Amazonian indigenous communities, including those in voluntary isolation, thus propagating the virus in horrendous proportions, killing off the elders as guardians of ancestral knowledge, practically wiping out many of the smaller tribal groups, and eliminating large numbers of the general population. But in both indigenous and Afro-descendant territories and communities throughout Latin America beyond the Amazon, the new strategy is the targeted elimination of children and youth. To kill off the children and youth, that is the future generation. In Brazil, the targeted assassination of Black youth by police has reached pandemic proportions. Obviously, we can make the parallel with the United States, but the proportions in Brazil are much, much greater than what has happened in the United States. But sometimes the US has central focus and not what happens outside its borders. Yeah. But also feminicides, transcides, in other words, against the killing of people identified as trans peoples, and racialized genocides throughout the region have greatly increased just since COVID began. In Colombia, one indigenous or Black leader a day has been killed since COVID began in March. And more than 70 massacres have occurred in indigenous and Black territories rich in natural resources. All this is further exacerbated by the limited access and often outright denial of healthcare as COVID continues to spread. I think of the parallels with Afro-American and Native American communities in the US, but also the parallels in African nations and many other places in the world. Is there any doubt, I ask, that the targeted de-existence is not just a myth, but it's actually in process today? For many, including myself, the critical question today is how to sow or plant life in these times of death. How to plant re-existence in these times of de-existence. Such questions, without a doubt, decolonial in substance, project, and motivation, are what are pushing the creation and making of small fissures or cracks in both rural and urban spaces today, enabling some hope and cultivating local forms of re-existence against the real threats of de-existence. I wonder how such cultivation might also be taking place elsewhere in the world. Is this not what decoloniality, at least in part, is all about, I ask? Is not decoloniality about struggles of and for life against, despite, without, and in the borders, cracks, and fissures of the racist, heteropatriarchal, capitalist, and modern colonial system and its mutations and new configurations in the era of COVID? For me, that's one of the central questions today. And obviously, part of that requires us to think about what is the praxis. How do we begin to build spaces, although small, of re-existence in times of real de-existence? So for time reasons, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Catherine. Walter, the floor is yours.
Oh, all right, thank you very much, Basie, for the introduction, Magda, Sinfree, for organizing this. There is a lot to talk about and a lot to do. So I will talk for about 15 minutes too, and I have 3 points also. I don't know if I will manage to talk about the 3 points, but when the 15 minutes arrive, I stop. So how do we get to decoloniality? My story, I came without knowing it, the experience, the discomfort. It started as a son of Italian immigrants in Argentina. Feeling from the one hand that I didn't belong to the country belonged to the people who kind of possessed the land since the 19th century. The kind of the families that came from the 18th century. So I didn't know that, but I feel that kind of discomfort in a small town of kind of Italian immigrant, the whole area in the west of Buenos Aires. And then I went to the university, and I don't know why, but I remember that I started reading Gramsci because I was studying philosophy. I started reading Gramsci and joining group of discussing Marx and Marxism, and that was in the 60s. With professor, but also with the majority of students. And one day I discovered that the second discomfort, because I mean, my friend, wonderful friend, wonderful minds, but I discovered that were all they kind of very Marxist, but at the same time, they were all of middle class. They were kind of son of dentists, of lawyers, of doctors, etc. And my father was a jornalero. I mean, he worked on the country and the countryside for the people who owned the land. And then he moved to a small town so I can go to the university, and he became a proletarian. And that was the second kind of discomfort. Say, how can we relate that kind of middle class concern with Marxism? And I having that kind of experience of living with the proletarian. So those are the things that you carry with you. You don't know what to do. But being in Argentina, and going to the university, and a lot of people were going back and forth from France. And I ended up kind of becoming interested in semiotics. I went to do the PhD in France. And then came the second discomfort because something was strange there. At the time, I mean, people coming from Latin America to Europe, Spain mainly, were either on the one hand were kind of discomfort, and we were called sudacas, people from the south, so kind of looking down. But on the other hand, we were kind of exotic because of the Latin American novel. So that was the Le Dernier Gazet d'Outre-mer, as the French used to say. So they were very interested in us because we were talking of that kind of culture. So, and then came to the United States. And again, I mean, the discomfort continue until somebody told me, started talking to me about the Chicanos. And I said, what are the Chicanos? I have no idea in the mid-70s what the Chicanos were. And then I learned what the Chicanos were, little by little, no? And so I became more informed. And in '87, I read Ansaldúa, Borderland, La Frontera. And that was the first coup, because I became interested in colonialism. I said, I am an Italo-Argentinian. So I wrote a book, The Darker Side of the Renaissance, which is a kind of autobiographical book, although it's a scholarly book. But I wrote it because to explain to myself, what is that kind of colonialism? Not only like how is colonialism that is military and economic and politically, but as Fanon said, I mean, colonialists kind of get into the soul and the mind of the colonized people and kind of change, erase their memories. Well, that is the Fanon experience, but also that helped me to understand how colonialists work in your subjectivity, how kind of make you feel inadequate, and that is a kind of insatisfaction. So I went into studying and reflecting in colonialism, but it was not just a scholarly interest. I was reflecting in colonialism and doing research because of my life. And in 1994, 93, I encountered Quijano's coloniality, and coloniality was epiphany, because put everything together. I began to understand that what happened to me happened to a lot of people, because what we call then after Quijano colonial patron de poder, or colonial matrix of power, is a logic that is underlying all the kind of the Western colonialism since the 16th century. And I began to understand, and Kathy said something very in that line at the beginning. I would say that a colonial matrix of power is the underlying structure of Western civilization. Western civilization is the youngest. There is no Western civilization before the Renaissance. Greece and Rome are Western after the Renaissance. Greece and Rome were not looking west, were kind of looking east. So that is a kind of the kind of epiphany, or reoriented my life and reoriented my research, but my research was related to my life. So now when I start talking about coloniality and decoloniality, and people ask me, students or colleagues, and especially students, I say, well, and especially now that, I mean, that decoloniality has become a buzzword, and it's good. I mean, everybody uses it, and it's good because something is going on, maybe fashion, maybe kind of other kind of interest. But I don't think, I don't spend time kind of correcting, trying to kind of spend time to advance what I think coloniality, decoloniality does for us. So the question here, if you want to enter coloniality, decoloniality, don't start by kind of theoretical, conceptual beginning, a starting point. I mean, that comes later. This entry point is, where does coloniality touch you? Where do you feel it? Think about yourself. Coloniality, as a student of mine said in a brilliant, and I cannot avoid that sentence, in a final report. They don't write paper, they write report about the kind of experience. And she said, coloniality is not over, it's all over. And that's it. So think about coloniality is touching you. And maybe it doesn't touch you. But if it doesn't touch you, you have to ask why coloniality is not touching me and it's touching my friends. Who is, I don't know, who is gay or people of color or kind of Muslim or coming from a... so coloniality touches everybody, even if there are people who are not being aware that they are touched by coloniality, because they belong to the people who exercise the coloniality of power. So as Fanon also said, I mean, Fanon said it, well, the question of decolonizing is not decolonizing the colonized, it's decolonizing the colonizer too, right? So this is a two ways. So the question of decoloniality is what kind of work we have to do. I mean, I won't talk about all the kind of the injustice around the world that Catherine enumerated very well, and COVID, what happened with COVID, the politicization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I will reduce myself to what can we, and this we, who are the we in this room? I mean, in this room, in this screen. Basically, there is a lot of work to do in what we may call the intellectual sphere. And that is a lot of talking about the colonizing the curriculum, the university, the museum, etc., etc. So that intellectual sphere is large. It's not just academic. Academic is one small place of that sphere. It touches journalism. It touches all the kind of television, all the kind of the images, the bombarding of images that come to us every day. And when you start thinking about is that what kind of another way of perpetuating coloniality and controlling subjectivity. So for all of us who are in this kind of intellectual sphere, one of the main concerns for me is that we are controlled by Western vocabulary. That we cannot think without going through Western vocabulary. We may like democracy or may not like democracy, but we cannot imagine other kind of political or horizon that democratic. What about Ubuntu? What about summa causae? What about all under heaven? Every civilization that kind of the Western destituted has a concept to kind of conceive living in harmony and living together. But the question when the decolonial said that, they come the Marxists and said we are romantic. Or come the kind of the postmodern and say, well, yeah, that we are romantic and they prefer other concept of democracy. But they say, well, come on. I mean, democracy is used by the state for purposes that are not really democratic. So one of the main tasks after the COVID, if there is an after COVID, let's hope that there is an after COVID. There will be, I mean, there are already a lot of work to do, but it is fundamental for me to kind of work in different options to the Western option that is still control our way of thinking, our sensibility, etc. And we know that knowing is living and living is knowing, but at the same time that knowing is that control our subjectivity. And we cannot change the world. That was another kind of things I realized at some point, remembering my Marxist years. And I mean, I admire Marx, don't get me wrong. Is that we cannot change the world because the world is nothing without us. So we cannot change the world if the people who are in the world don't change. So that is the question of the decolonial praxis, and I think Catherine explained that very well. The decolonial praxis is not just to go into the street and protest. That's important. To protest, to do what happened in Chile a few weeks ago, what happened in Bolivia, what happened in the Gilets Jaunes in France, what happened after George Floyd in United States. To do that, you don't need decoloniality. So the question is, what does decoloniality offer to this kind of growing global consciousness of how people are manipulated, exploited, controlled, etc. So I think that next to all the kind of the tasks that Kathy enumerated, I think that it's a very important, crucial task in what we can call epistemology or understanding or kind of the domain of knowledge that control the colonial matrix of power. Because knowledge is all over. Political theory and political economy is knowledge. The question of racism is not the question of color. Question is not the question of blood. Question is not the question of religion. Question is somebody who controls knowledge and has the concept of the human that allows to classify and rank the other people in the world and other regions in the world. And I finish with how kind of this kind of knowledge, but it's already taken for granted, it's a kind of common sense, is circulating now. Well, Trump is very known for kind of being explicitly racist. And Biden seems to be a little bit more kind of aware of that, and he did a good job. Kamala Harris, the appointment they are making, that kind of a lot of women of color, very important. And President Biden have a conversation, I finish with this, with the president of Argentina, who is a kind of interesting experience what is going on there. And so Biden said in the telephone conversation transcribed by the news that he would like to work with Argentina because there is significant amount of natural resources and a population of European descent. So races there is double. It's not just the people of European descent that is. Natural resources is the kind of the equivalent of races because the West, at the same time that invented racism and sexism, invented the concept of nature. And nature is there to be controlled, to be exploited for the well of the Industrial Revolution, the technological revolution, etc. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done also, I mean, parallel to work at the level of consciousness, the kind of reconciliation, learning to unlearn in order to relearn. That may be probably a good summary of the task we have to do in the places we are, the university, the school, journalism, museum, etc., etc. But I stop there.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Walter. Commonly we start with a question from Dr. Macconi. So we will follow our tradition. Dr. Macconi, over to you.
Thank you very much to Catherine and Walter. I've got two questions for Catherine, then I'll have two questions for Walter. As I was preparing for this talk, amongst other things, was that I went and reread the book edited by Bernard Reiter called Constructing the Pluriverse, in which both of you have got chapters. So my questions to Catherine would to some extent be partially based on my reading of that book and my listening to your talk. In this particular book, Constructing the Pluriverse, Reiter, for example, in the introduction, makes the following suggestion, it makes the following claim. And I quote, Western approaches to European science do not contain the tools to ask different questions and find new and different answers. Let's just assume that he is right. If he is right, the question then, which I'm posing to Catherine, is as follows. How then do you turn non-Western ontologies and epistemologies into research programs and research designs in a university? You are assuming that Western science cannot enable you to ask these are the new questions. So you are then left with the alternative that you are left with. One of the alternatives is that you then have to turn to non-Western ontologies. So the question then becomes, how then do you design research programs and projects based on these non-Western ontologies?
Thank you, Century. let me put it a little bit in the concrete context of the doctoral program that I mentioned that Walter has also participated in over the last 20 years that we have here. When we began this doctoral program, and maybe some of Magda's experiences too, and the master's were similar, the issue was first how to think from here. That is, how to think from Latin America, but also how to think from the souths of the world first. That's not to deny that the rest of the so-called Western world exists, but it's to reverse what usually happens in universities. In other words, first, usually, it's the study of so-called universal knowledge, the canon, right? And then later, one gets to the local context in terms of sort of case studies, right? But here, the process has been to turn that upside down. What does it mean to think from here? And particularly from the world senses, the world knowledges, the world views constructed in this territory that challenge the still white control that's present within Latin America. In other words, one can talk about South geographically, but oftentimes the westernization of Latin American universities takes a parallel to the North, right? Sort of what today is called the global university. Parallels that I know also exist in South Africa. So one could begin to think about, as we did here, what does it mean to ask the question, who do we want to think with? Why? And with what project? That sort of paralleled the issue of who the students are. So in the process of acceptance of students into the program, one of the key criteria is that those students that come from all of Latin America and occasionally from other places in the world have had a strong base in processes of social struggle in their own countries. Some are social movement leaders, others work in schools or academic spaces, right? But we had a large percentage, a large number of Indigenous, of Black students, growing numbers of women, including women of color. So it's sort of how to change that base and how to think from and with the knowledge is produced in this part of the world and not to study about something that I mentioned before. So in that sense, as Sinfree mentioned or asked in the question, non-Western ontology, epistemologies, cosmologies are the base of our thinking. In other words, it's how to build a thinking from a different logic. That's not to assume that all students that enter the program or that all faculty that work in the program necessarily understand or think from those logics, right? But it's how to create a sort of different space where we challenge westernized logics and ways of thinking, not to eliminate, but to challenge them as the only possibility, and to construct what we might call, and as the book that Sinfree mentioned has in its title, the pluriversal. In other words, other ways of thinking, right? That oftentimes the universal tends to shroud, erase, eliminate. So those processes have been particularly key. 20 years of experience with many, many graduates from all over who take the seeds of that program back to their own spaces, to their own territories, to their own countries, and to universities in other countries have enabled this to grow. So one could say this is a kind of way of building a decolonizing project in Praxis where ontologies, epistemologies, and existence-based ways of thinking and being are central to the kinds of questions that we ask. So I could say much more, Sinfree, but I think for reasons of time, I should probably stop there.
Okay, yes, then that leads me to my second and last question to you. I I can understand the logic of trying to mobilize indigenous ontologies and epistemologies and using that as the basis. But as I reflected on your work, I read a couple of articles in which you were talking about beyond Vivier. I don't know whether I pronounced it correct. There's a 2010 article that you wrote called Development as Beyond Vivier, Institutional Arrangements and Decolonial Entanglements. And as I came to the end of the article, I wasn't very sure what was the nature of the argument you were making. Because you begin by saying this concept of beyond Vivier is at the core of the Ecuadorian constitution. But towards the end, you seem to have been suggesting that there is some incompatibility between that concept of beyond Vivier and the Ecuadorian constitution. The question then became to me, is it that these indigenous ontological concepts are incompatible with notions of constitutional arrangement, or is it that the notion of beyond Vivier is multi-layered, is fluid, and it cannot be easily used in a constitutional arrangement, right? So those are the questions to me, because I wasn't sure what exactly was the core of the argument you were making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If one understands, I guess, a translation of Buen Vivir into English would be life in plentitude.
Yes.
Right? So initially, and what Walter mentioned, Sumakausai is a way in Quechua, one of the principal indigenous languages here, to talk about that. The way that a philosophical or existence-based notion of being in life is constructed, one could say in indigenous communities, but also in a similar sense, but different, in Black communities, where the notion of collective well-being, very much parallel, one could say, to Ubuntu, is also very key. So what happens when those notions are put into a constitution? One could say instrumentalized, right? Many that are listening may not know that Ecuador, as Bolivia, went through in 2007 to 2008 a rethinking of the Constitution in radically different terms. Some say that Ecuador's Constitution is the most radical in the world. Not only does it name the state as plurinational and intercultural, but also uses the notion of this living in plentitude, which is not capitalist living, which is not a neoliberalized notion of living, but living as part of nature, with nature, in a different philosophy of life, gives the base to the entire Constitution. So those of us that participate in that process, I had the privilege to be an advisor to the Constitution. So I participated in a lot of the debates, which were not with political parties, but with rather representatives from different social sectors of the country. In those processes, the hope was that with a different philosophical base that was very different from the typical neoliberal capitalist-based logic that organizes constitutions, that could serve as a base to sort of refound society, right? That hope was basically wiped out or denied in the processes of state and government. So basically what we learned in this process is that when a philosophy, a way of being that's lived is put into a constitution and then given in the hands of state, and the state constructed it as a way to rethink development, but basically to use many of the same tools of westernized notions of development, of Eurocentered development, of what is sometimes called in European nations integral development, right? It lost its hold. So basically, the problem that I outlined in that article that Sinfri mentioned that I wrote many years ago was how the hope constructed and that took base in this philosophical notion of changing the way that we live, to live in harmony, one could say, with others and with other beings that aren't necessarily human beings, right? Including with ancestors. When that was put into state, it became instrumentalized. It became functional to the state project. So basically, the learning here is the danger of what happens when state co-ops, uses concepts that have a different, a radically distinct base of existence and tries to use them as a new way to control and instrumentalize the population. So the learnings were great. The learnings, I think, in a simple sense, taught us not to put our hope in state itself. The change happens from the bottom up. It doesn't happen from top down. And when state takes control of concepts that are constructed from the bottom, from the basis, from community basis, and instrumentalizes or functionalizes them, and then uses them against the very populations that constructed them is the problem. So Buen Vivir became sort of the slogan, a slogan that we could say has parallels today with the use of the word decolonial when it's manipulated. So Buen Vivir could mean anything. It could mean good food, to eat in to be able to eat in a good restaurant. It could mean to have access to open tourism that takes over communities. It could mean extractivism. It began to become manipulated in a different way. So in summary, Sinfri, my argument would be that the problem is that when something that's constructed from the bottom up, that's producing a different way of thinking, is taken on by state and controlled by state, it not only loses its significance, but it becomes a dangerous tool where development, in the worst sense of the word, takes over people's life.
Good. Thank you very much. I think this gives us an opportunity. This gives me an opportunity to shift to asking Walter just two questions as well, then we'll open up the floor. Walter, in the papers that you sent me recently, your 2020 responses to discussions about decoloniality, let me read you back one passage that stood out to me. You say that there is no object of study that decoloniality can exhaust. Objects or events will always exceed decoloniality. There is no single method that will exhaust the objects or events. Decoloniality is an option amongst others. Now, my question is this. If there are no objects that can be exhausted through decoloniality, it implies that in any analysis, you would require to mobilize decoloniality and other analytical apparatus. My question is, from your experiences, what are the other frameworks that you tend to use to complement your decolonial analysis of events or text?
Could you repeat the last question, because there was a message came and click and kind of distracted.
Oh,
the last point.
The last point is that since you are saying that decoloniality cannot exhaust the analysis of an event or a text. So my question is, when you are carrying out your research decolonially, what are the other frameworks that you may use to complement decoloniality?
Okay. I don't remember. I don't remember the text I sent you that you referred to, but I will address. I will address the question. Well, I think the question is very important because it touches a nodal point in what we can call, I call now the kind of the decolonial investigation, the politics of decolonial investigation.
Yes, yes.
So since we are in that, I mean, not just academic investigation. I mean, the Zapatistas do a lot of investigation. I mean, they have to build argument. I mean, they are not a university, but Sherlock Holmes was a tremendous investigator. He was not in the academy. So the question here is, point number one is to the link, as we said, the Western idea that there is a knowing subject and is a known object. Mm-hmm. That has to be gone. So what is the point of decolonial investigation? The decolonial investigation is to understand how the colonial matrix of power works. Why do we want to do that? Not because we want the truth, not because we want to introduce a new school of sociological thought, because we want to know how the colonial matrix of power control us. Because we cannot the link and go into re-existing, as Catherine said, if we don't understand how we are being controlled. And there is a lot of ways of being controlled, but the decolonial contribute to understanding the formation, transformation, and today I will say the dispute of the colonial matrix of power. So that is the first point. The second point, kind of illustrate, I'd like to do pedagogically an analogy with psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis when the kind of the practice of psychoanalysis, when the psychoanalyst is sitting with somebody who's telling a story because he has a problem, he or she has a problem. So what the psychoanalyst does and listen, I think that the psychoanalyst is doing two things at the same time. On the one hand, is listening to this story that is singular. There is no other similar. Each people being analyzed has her own story. So the psychoanalyst is thinking about that. I mean, listening to that. But at the same time, the psychoanalyst is how the unconscious is working in that story. And how that is, what this story is telling me about the unconscious. Okay, replace unconscious for colonial measure of power, and this is the politics of the colonial investigation. In any kind of event, text, circumstances, whatever, that come to us and kind of awake our interest, the question is how the coloniality of power is working in this event and what this event is telling me about the colonial matrix of power. So that is the that is a kind of a fundamental politic of the colonial investigation for me. That kind of the link. I don't have other word. The link from the academic and scholarly requirement and the disciplinary requirement. And the third point is why option. Some people say, well, no, shouldn't be an option, should be an imperative. Well, yes, I understand that. But the question, if you do the decolonial and imperative, you become imperial, right? Mm-hmm. You cannot pretend that it was relevant and imperative for you would be imperative for everybody else. That was the politic of Christianity, that's the politic of Islam, that is the politic of secular civilization and progress. So for me, the power of talking about decoloniality as an option is something that you put on the table for people who feel like embracing it. But more important, everything else is an option. And that is the important point. So there are, we can call option of belief, that is what we call religion. There are options, right? There are system of ideas, Marxism and liberalism and neoliberal. There are options. They are not kind of, they are not ontological. They create ontology. Ontology is always epistemological creation. And then we have the disciplinary options. The disciplines are options. I kind of with it's all their own kind of regulation. So the question for me is that the politic of decolonial investigation has to help us to get out of this colonial matrix of power that control the way we know, we control the way we are in the world, and the expectation of how should be in the world according to this kind of common sense that the colonial matrix of power put there in the imaginary of people. And I want to say one more thing quickly because it's related to this. You know, Kathy moved from the north to the south and I moved from the south to the north. So the question for me in the politics of the colonial investigation is not the global south. I don't deny that. The only thing I will do is that one thing is the global south of one thing is the south of Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and the other thing is the kind of the south of Africa or the south of America. In any case, for me, the question is border thinking, border living, border lines. So for me, the politics of the colonial investigation is always a kind of being, living in the border because I am the North. I cannot pretend that I feel, yes, of course, I belong to the South, but I have been 40 years in the North. So I live constantly that kind of experience in the kind of the borderland. And that is what I learned from Ansaldúa. Ansaldúa was, before Quijano, was a crucial moment in my life, not just in the way I think, but also in the way I live.
Okay, right. Let me ask the last a short question, then we can, then I can open up the discussion. In one of your many publications, I think this one you wrote it with, I think is a Russian scholar called Klaas, no, I can't pronounce it properly, but you refer to India and China as second-class empires. Now, let's just assume that the description is right. The question that I'm asking is, how is coloniality is carried out by these second-class empires manifesting itself globally? In other words, is the colonial matrix of power is manifested by these second-class empires substantially different from the experiences that we have had so far with other empires?
Well, thank you again. That is a very important question because, I mean, in the sense that one of the things that the coloniality does for me is allow me to understand the global order. Mm-hmm. The global order was formed in the 16th century and what happened today. So the question of the second-class empire, which actually is more of a Tlostanova concept that I also embraced because I thought was useful. Mm-hmm. The question here to understand the present mm-hmm. From the history of the colonial matrix of power, and not mm-hmm. the history of events, but the history of the logic that regulates this event. So the colonial matrix of power, or the process of westernization from 1500 to 2000, the Western formed itself, the Western empire from Spain to United States, right? And kind of expanded and formed this, and control, manage, form, transform, and control the colonial mixture of power. By 2000, this kind of monster escaped the lab of Frankenstein. So the West can no longer control the monster that has created. And that has to do with the kind of the rise of China, the kind of the changes of Trump, the changes in Russia, the kind of the dispute with Iran, etc. So they are not questioning the colonial mixture of power. They are disputing who controls it. Mm-hmm. So in the sense, the second-class empire is that they couldn't escape the logic. I mean, China is capitalist. Everything is capitalist now. Russia is capitalist. Iran is capitalist. But the question is, and neither Russia nor China, Iran has been colonized like was India, for example. There was no settler colonialism, but they couldn't escape coloniality. Coloniality is that kind of perverse logic that doesn't need settlers necessarily. There are other ways to do it. So there are two things here quickly. On the one hand, I explained that kind of articulation between the second-class empire as imperial differences, which works at another level of the colonial difference. So the colonial is not that schematic, but I don't have time to go into detail. So the colonial difference was put in place in the 16th century relation to indigenous, to African, and in Europe to Jews, right? So people without state, without empire. But in the case of China, in the case of Russia, they couldn't kind of colonize. I mean, Russia became a kind of, first a Tsarate and then came into empire with Ivan the Terrible. So on the one hand, the world order today is kind of governed by the production and maintenance of the imperial colonial difference, and the colonial difference. And that helps me to make another kind of distinction. The big conflict that we see today, we are living in, and COVID has a lot to do with this, is that the planet today, we all in the planet are living, experiencing a multipolar world order. The unipolar world order that governed the planetary relation from 1500 and 2000 is gone. And this is a conflict, and it's not a transition. It's not a transition from unipolar to multipolar. The transitions are kind of explainable within the same logic of the West. But here we are no longer in the logic of the West. So the coexistence between unipolarity that the United States is trying to maintain once lost hegemony just come to domination and Europe following, coexist with multipolarity. And on the other hand, everything that Catherine said in the third part of there is an awakening of a kind of the global consciousness that I will call decoloniality at large, even if that kind of the movement in Chile or it's not necessarily decolonial. I mean, self-conceived decolonial. But I describe them as decolonial because it's an awareness of different form of domination. It's not just exploitation of labor. It's a much more complex thing. So this is where it's in this domain where the question of knowledge become very important. Is in this domain where we talk about pluriversality. It's no longer universality that corresponds to unipolarity, and multipolarity corresponds to pluriversality. But there are two different things, the way that the multipolar the Westernization works and the way that the pluriversality is kind of breaking away with the belief of universality. That universality may be secular or theological, but universality is what is kind of exploding. And I think that the Decolonial has a very important task to do in that. I mean, Quijano talked about epistemological reconstitution. That was for him decoloniality in 1990. There is more to say about this, but I leave it there. Epistemological reconstitution is a starting point to think about pluriversality.
Okay. Magda, I hand over to you. I de-link from the conversation.
It's healthy to the link.
You are doing the wrap up, so you cannot delink really. I would like to briefly come back to the concept that you both mentioned and you both wrote about extensively, summa causae, and connected with the field of education, and particularly language in education. In many Latin American countries, and Ecuador is a good example of it, we have English language policies that ask students, especially university students, to achieve a high proficiency in English in order to graduate from an Ecuadorian university. English became a mandatory subject from the 2nd grade in Ecuador, so everybody is learning English. English is this language that will open the door to the world. And then we have summa causae, which is this ontological concept. I'm not talking about buen vivir, I'm talking about summa causae as conceived by the indigenous epistemic community of plentiful life and taking care of the well-being within the community. So finding the endogenous solutions for the well-being. So my question is, what can we educators and also what can policymakers unlearn and relearn from summa causae?
Is there an order here, Magda, or you want me to go ahead and then Walter, or?
As you wish to answer it.
Go ahead, since I already talk a lot.
Yeah. There's a debate today, Magda, if because of the association of buen vivir or its functionalization or instrumentalization in the Constitution and summa causae being considered by the state as the same, why it's important that communities themselves rethink what this concept really means. Some communities say that before it was recognized in the Constitution, it existed, but people didn't necessarily name it, right? It's part of everyday life that's been constructed generation after generation and passed down by the elders to the newer, to future generations. What does all this mean, like you ask, in education, right? I think at one sense, as you clearly stated at the beginning, there's a contradiction between an educational process that continues and increasingly looks to the North as the basis of, yes, universal knowledge and universal language use, English being, as you mentioned, sort of the way into the future, the way into modernity, the way into Western civilization, leaving native civilizations behind, right? Worse yet, if we think about how educational structures mandated by the Ministry of Education require the same kind of evaluations and global instruments that exist now throughout the world. In the short time that I spent in South Africa and conversations that I had with folks there, the same instruments were being used in many Latin American countries, as well as in the US, etc., about how to evaluate faculty, how to evaluate students, right? And what are sort of the global competencies that students should achieve. And their language is central. So if summa causae is a concept, a way of being built on territory and built through native language, the logic of a native language, what happens when that gets translated into Spanish as the dominant language of society, and worse yet, into English, right? So the contradiction here is very clear. Interestingly, what's happened in these times of so-called COVID, where roughly 60 to 70% of students from primary school on do not have access to internet and cannot do virtual education, which is still, schools are still not open here. So what happens is that in many communities and in many urban neighborhoods, folks are going back to creating their own educational process. An educational process that's connected to life, that's connected to existence and not connected to the global competencies that the Ministry of Education, UNESCO, etc., tries to spread throughout the world. So I would say that we're at interesting moments. I mean, if one sort of looks at the positive side of these times that we're living in, the construction of new forms of educational practice, of rethinking education as directly connected to the necessities of life and collective living in times where the collective is each time more fragmented and individualism takes place. I mean, the fact that we can't touch one another, see one another physically, but have to look at one another on camera is part of this, right? But it's worse yet, what happens and how these times break the collective force of communities and make one think about oneself and one's immediate family and not the broader collective. So the processes taking place, I would say, are reconstructing summa causae, not necessarily saying that they're doing it, but are constructing it in practice in small spaces, in an urban neighborhood, in a rural community context, because of the necessity of thinking about what life means in these times when life is put up against death, up against the de-existence that I mentioned that's happening. So I think the times are interesting because they make one wonder, and as Walter said, if there's a post-COVID, which we don't know if there is or not, whether in fact this marks a new route for education to take. Education that's based, that's strongly based in smaller spaces, in the needs and issues and desires and knowledges that exist in that space, rather than global competencies or global demands that have taken form. And if in fact those who will stay in the so-called formal or official education system will increasingly become those students who are white or whitened and of higher class privilege, because they have the apparatus, the computers, the technology to connect through internet, etc. So what we're seeing is a reformulating of what education means. Education in the official sense and education in a community collective sense. And I think that brings into reflection today possibilities of building a notion of summa causae, not just in indigenous communities, but one could say as a social project that's taking place without necessarily naming it.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Catherine. We do have a number of questions from Teboho, Busi, Valetta, Brett, Tembi, Desmond Shines, and Kimberly. During the session, and if there are any outstanding questions, they can then be taken up in the course of the after-party session. So, Teboho, you have a question.
What?
Microphone.
Oh.
Am I?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Good morning. And thank everybody who's attended. My question is for both speakers or presenters. Is the dominant opinion makers in the West. You could take the example of global ranking of universities. You could take Ivy League schools in America, are bound by their own pursuit of what they consider to be excellence. And they probably have no regard to decoloniality, etc. They would think it is not relevant. We can look at the example of, at the moment, the vaccine for COVID-19. For them, it's a competition to see that they show excellence by finding the cure for vaccine and forget about others. Like the Russians claim that they have a vaccine, the Chinese, but I think it just passed over our head. We don't even know that they did anything at all. So what I'm emphasizing is the dominant opinion makers of the West are concerned with what they consider to be excellence, and domination just follows. And decoloniality is, in my view, a response that is probably struggling to make itself recognized. Maybe ideally in the future, decoloniality hopes for a universality that is represented by convergence of a scholarship, philosophies, etc., where we think all of us belong and are as important. Is there ideally any chance in future there will be any universality other than the universality of competition, domination, and action and response? The dominant North as acting in dominance, and the colonial South acting in competition to see if they catch up or they become as important as well. Is there any point in the future where there could be convergence of the two spheres?
Okay, thanks.
What
Is that
are
clear?
the two? What are the two? Decolonial
The two, I'm saying dominant North
yeah.
blazes its own path, and decoloniality responses is we would like to be part of the creation of knowledge in the world.
Let's see, Catherine or Walter, would you like to fill the question?
Yeah. I wanna connect it with the summa causa. But I would start by say, I don't see that as kind of the global south and the global north. What about the global east? The global east that is transforming the global order. I think we cannot forget that. And the question is, you cannot think at this moment decolonially, if you don't think about this kind of the transformation and massive movement of capital and control to the West. And I don't mean just China. I mean, Russia is not a powerhouse, economic powerhouse, but it's a nuclear powerhouse. And you cannot forget Iran, and you cannot forget Central Asia. The fight today is for Central Asia. If you look at the map, you have Russia, you have China, you have Iran. Central Asia is the present struggle to the future. So I think that the convergence is not just a convergence between global south and global north. That is one thing. So the question is that the decolonial coexist and will coexist through the 21st century with the effort to maintain re-Westernization and the kind of the march toward the Westernization and multipolarity. We can no longer think about the global north and global south. That is kind of forgetting, not just forgetting half of the world, forgetting that more than a half of the population in the world live in that kind of circle of China, Indonesia, India. I think it's just too much Atlantic way of thinking, thinking a kind of the global north and the global south. So that is one thing. But and we know the vaccine is one more kind of way of how and Kathy talk about that, who are kind of who are being destitute, the young, the youngster, the child, etc. And that is not new. I mean, since the last stage of globalization in the 90s, the problem of globalization was the rest. What to do with the rest? There is too many people and there is just limited resources, and we have to kind of eliminate. So in general, you have, and that is not summa causa, but for me, summa causa is very interesting case of living in the border and border thinking. Because one thing is when the indigenous people talk about summa causa, they took according to their cosmology. I mean, I have been in conversation for a while now with Fernando Banacuni Mamani, who wrote a wonderful book on summa causa buen vivir. And the question is, when we non-indigenous kind of embrace summa causa or Ubuntu or so when I do that, the people say, well, but why summa causa? You are not, well, let me say that before. When summa causa is kind of endorsed by many intellectuals that are not indigenous now, that is kind of integrated to Western cosmology. So that's the kind of border thinking, right? It's not just a question of the languages, it's a question that the cosmology comes from the language. Spanish and English kind of belong to the Western cosmology. And summa causa belong to the Quechua, Aymara, Quichua cosmology, right? So that is what do we do with teaching? So when I said that about summa causa, people say, well, you are not indigenous. Why you are kind of interested in summa causa? I said, listen, I am not Greek either, but I have to learn Plato and Aristotle. I am not German either, but I read Marx. So it's like if you are doing something that is not you, but is Western, nobody question. But if you go into Ubuntu, summa causa, you are anthropologizing, you are romanticizing. No. For me, the question is, I am learning from Aymaras as when I was a student, learned from Aristotle and Plato. I am interested in Plato and Aristotle, but that is no longer affecting my life. But summa causa affect my life because that kind of challenges me. at this moment, the kind of reconstitution of the kind of way living in plenitude, living in harmony, that the indigenous people are doing, but also the Afro, they know what they're doing. The problem is us. The problem is for us that have been schooled in Western cosmology, and now we began to realize the limit of Western cosmology. So we are a kind of a subaltern position in relation to the future. And the future depends, don't think about the future without thinking about the present. Don't escape the present. The future will depend on what we do in the present. It is modernity and globalization and that kind of convince you that by 2030, we will have sustainable development. And by 2050, I don't remember which one is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they are kind of hiding the present and providing you with the image of the future. So the last question I want to say is teaching. That's even important because, I mean, it's a lot of talk about decolonizing the university and decolonizing the curriculum. Well, yes and no. I don't think that you can decolonize the university at this moment because the university are kind of ingrained with the corporate world. Not just the corporate world because of the money, it's that the mentality of the administrator. The universities are being run as a corporation. So that will be very difficult for us, but we have to do, and we can do decolonial work at the university. So an example of teaching, for 25 years, I have been teaching a course that I was asked to teach. And when I was asked to teach by the department, I said, well, you are crazy. I don't think we will have any students on that. I said, well, yeah, you try. So the course is, they put the title, Maya, Incas, and Aztec, the indigenous cosmologies, the cosmologies of indigenous of Latin America, something like that. Well, I taught it. And until today, the course is full the second or third day of the registration. What do I do in that course? I teach basic cosmology, but more important, how these kind of cosmologies are being activated today by the kind of indigenous. I don't talk about indigenous movement, but the indigenous political rearticulation of their cosmology confronted with the Western cosmology. They live in the border too, in a kind of different border because of the power differential. But they cannot rearticulate their cosmology without thinking that they have the state, they have the university that control knowledge in front of them. So I think that the teaching for me depends on where are you teaching, who are your students. And the experience of this seminar was fantastic for me because it's the first day of classes. So what we will do is learning to unlearn in order to relearn. And little by little, the students at the end of the semester began to understand their own limitation. And that, I think, is the success of the course. Not that the student learn a lot of facts about history, about indigenous people. They learn about themselves through reflection of what has been hidden from them since high school. It's fantastic when they began to enter into that, they began to become mad because why nobody talked to me in the high school? I am in the 4th year at Duke, and this is the first time I think about, I hear about this kind of thing. So I think education and not the schooling is crucial because what modernity does is schooling people, not educated. And education is conversation. It's not transmitting information. That is the kind of the mantra of modernity that eliminates the conversation and converts everything in information and communication. So the distinction between communication and conversation is fundamental, especially now with a kind of control of subjectivity that we are going through the iPod, the ePod, the iPod, the whatever, the kind of internet, etc., the television. We are bombarded. Technology today, among other things, is preventing people to think. And I think a basic role for me of education is to preserve in the present for the future the beauty and the need of thinking.
Okay, thank you very much, Walter. I'll just take I'll read out some two quick questions, incidentally, all addressed to Catherine. And then we will move to the after party session. The first one is from Violetta. She wants to know how Catherine relates her own concept of de-existence to Achille Mbembe's necropolitics. So are there any divergences between Catherine's concept of de-existence and Mbembe's notion of necropolitics? And then a second question for Catherine comes from Tembi. Tembi asks, in thinking with and by centering traditional epistemologies, how do we avoid the danger of anthropologizing? So in thinking with and by centering traditional epistemologies, how do we avoid the danger of anthropologizing? Catherine?
Thank you, Basi, and thanks for the questions. Well, let's think a little bit about the relation and the distinction between de-existence, as I was explaining it, and Mbembe's necropolitics. I mean, if we think maybe a simple way to describe Mbembe's concept is necropolitics means the kind of use of social power to dictate how some can live and how others should not live, right? And for Mbembe, as many of you may know, it's also tied a lot to Foucault, to the notion of biopower, right? In that sense, if we think about what's happening today, not just in Latin America, but in the world, the notion that some will survive, that some will make it through COVID and others will not, that there's the need to eliminate certain sections or certain sectors of the population, most particularly in terms of racialization, in terms of territory, etc. One could say, well, necropolitics seems to make sense. But the distinction, I would say, is that if we're thinking de-existence, not with Foucault, not as a kind of academic concept, but what actually people that are facing extermination are describing about their own situation. In other words, to understand, if we think from the colonial matrix of power that both Walter and I describe in the book and that we've been sharing here, right, that has this long history, where the actual classification of certain sectors of the population, where race and gender, but also heteronormativity have been key ways to mark who's more human and who's less human. We can go back to Fanon in terms of thinking with that as well, the zone of non-being, right? How that takes form in practical sense today in territories. So in territories, not just of Latin America, but I think what's occurring, yes, as Walter said, in countries of the East, but also in African nations, where certain sectors of the population that are no longer seen as useful are being eliminated. But how do people themselves see that situation? So de-existence is not just about the issue of death. right? But it's also how a practice of what we might term depossession, of violence, depossession, of war, and of death begin to interweave. And how that's begun to build in the last years before COVID, and how COVID sort of works as a way to enable the elimination of some, but also with it, the elimination of knowledge, of territories, of the place of life, right? So I would say that there's parallels between what I'm thinking and what I'm talking about with Membe, but the base of that thinking comes from a different place. So that we can say, yes, there's a so-called social power that's working to enable some to live and to eliminate others, no? But what's happening in the ways that that elimination takes place and where it takes place is crucial to think about today, right? How, as I said, the elimination of knowledges, of ways of being in the world, but also extractivism of territory. So to take over territories and put it in the hands of extractive industries, right? Aligned with state, but also aligned increasingly with narco trafficking, for example, in many places in Latin America, are part of the de-existence, right? So my suggestion is that de-existence is not a concept like necropolitics is that we can apply, but it's rather something that's being constructed in daily struggle in different places of the world. And what happens when we connect those struggles, right? So it's I guess what one could say, a sort of a way of analyzing and theorizing collectively from below and not from an academic concept, not attempting to apply it elsewhere, but begin to connect those ways that people are struggling for existence and life in different parts of the world today under a new, what we might call global regime of control, right? Where, as Walter said, sort of the imperial colonial difference is key, but also the new configurations of the new mutations of the way that power is taking place in the hands of increasingly fewer, right? And increasingly more centered today, with COVID being one example of that. So I mean, I could go on, but in terms of time, I'll stop there with the Membe connection or non-connection. Of course, thinking with Membe, the notion of how traditional epistemologies could be how do you say it? Yeah, that thing. Made into anthropology, right? There's a danger. Because again, if we think about the structure of universities, but also the structure of education, of schooling itself, the tendency is to study about, right? So when something new is introduced that comes from a population and considered native, considered indigenous, or considered as part of the Black diaspora, for example, that typically has not been part of university education or schooling, or in schooling in the sort of official sense, then it becomes sort of a new study of anthropological observation, right? How do we observe these other epistemologies or traditional epistemologies, as Thembe said, right? And how do we study about them? I think from a decolonial perspective, and thinking about practice or pedagogies, or Walter described in our teaching, the issue is not to study about, it's to think with. And how does that thinking with create a different way of working, of thinking, of being, where oneself has to be present, So to think with, I need to challenge my own thinking. I need to consider the ways that I've been socialized, the epistemologies or structures of logics, philosophies, etc., that have formed my own formation or deformation, right? And to be able to challenge that with thinking with others. And so the ways, oftentimes in my own practice, that we do that is not because we study in a book or an article what the traditional cosmology or epistemology is, but rather because of the location of the place where I work, the possibility of fellow students who come from and are part of those so-called traditional epistemologies, but also with social movements that also move within and out of the university on a daily basis here. We construct those together. So the issue is not, let's learn about this other way of thinking, right? But rather how this other way of thinking, and that connects directly to what Walter was describing before, challenges my own way of thinking, right? Many students say, as Walter mentioned, they get angry or they also enter in crisis, right? Now, how do I think about myself, right? How do I continue my own thinking and being in this situation where I know now that what I've been taught is not the only way of being and thinking? How do I challenge myself? How do I see the ways that privilege continues to create itself, right? And so that's I think is the difference. It certainly ties to a pedagogical praxis, right? And I noticed in the chat that someone else asked about sort of the pedagogy, right? What does this mean in teaching? And I think that's central. I mean, what Walter and I are talking about is not an abstract conceptual theory that has no base of practice. The issue is not to make decoloniality a new universal, but rather it's to use a way of questioning how we are in the world, who we relate to, how we define not only our identities per se, but our sense of being. And how in these times particularly, the stark individualism that capitalism has made the normality enters into crisis. And so how being and thinking with others creates a new sense or a necessary sense or an urgency that many of us feel. And it becomes increasingly frustrating when we can't leave the house, right? So I think those parts are important to think about. That in my own case, the years that I worked with Paulo Freire, the years that I was involved with critical pedagogy, it gave me a base to think about not just how do we teach in a school or how do we teach in a classroom, but how actually teaching is part of life, this part of our own learning and unlearning and relearning, right? And that which we do as students, and how we create those environments when we're in the classroom, for example, is a necessary part of decolonial work. How we ask the questions, how we construct the questions, and how we begin to look not just for a simple answer, but how we understand that the questions lead to other questions, where the base is really about existence and life itself, particularly in these times. So in that sense, I think the notion of the with, thinking with and thinking from, is very important to not end up in a new anthropological mode that marks decoloniality. Decoloniality is not about indigenous peoples, right? Which many people assume. It's a new anthropology, some say, where the indigenous has the center, right? No, it's about all of us. It's about all of us rethinking. And the ways, when we begin to look at other ways of thinking, other ways of knowing, and other ways of being that have existed for centuries, for millennials, not just in Latin America, but in other places of the world. Those challenge the logics that we've been taught to believe are necessary, okay? So the idea is to open up, to fissure that universal logic that we've taken as ours, and to challenge it. And I think that's what decolonial work is about. It's about questioning ourselves, rethinking ourselves, but always in conjunction with, right? It's not an individual project, it's necessarily a collective project. So in that sense, it's something that we all need to address and think about.
Can I make a quick observation before we move to, but before the quick observation, yes, there is that kind of myth that decoloniality has to do with the indigenous people. Has to do. They know we cannot teach the indigenous people. We cannot tell them, hey, you know, you have been colonized. They know it and they don't need us. So that I think is very important. But my observation is about necropolitic and de-existence. Because I said before, think about where coloniality touch you, but also look where do you see, where you perceive coloniality working. So in that question on the necropolitic and the existence, coloniality is working perfectly well. Why? Because, and Catherine explained it very well, the question is, how do you relate these two concepts in abstract? As is the kind of all the concepts. That is what modernity prevents you to ask. Who is producing that concept? In what context that concept has meaning? And where is the other concept coming from? So the question is, don't get lost in the universe of abstract concepts. Look about those concepts relate to the enunciation. Who is saying it? Why is saying it? Related to what experience, etc. And that is how coloniality, coloniality under modernity has been schooled us to just talk about contents and concepts, not about what is going on, what is at stake in such and such a concept. Coloniality is all over in the most unexpected places. So pay attention.
Thank you so much. Actually, it's 11 Easter time, which means that we reached actually the end of after party even without noticing that we are in the after party because we're still moderating. So it took a little bit more of time. We're trying to be just flexible. We still have questions. Some of the questions Catherine already answered by expanding on education, because many of them were related to education, but there's still some more questions. So what we can do, those of us that can still stay for some more moments, let's, first of all, let's have Anna Caper, who is editing with Dr. McConey, a fantastic book about voices of people that wish to unlearn and relearn. So she would very briefly talk about it. And then we will have really the unmoderated part in which those of you that still have some questions can ask them. So Anna, if you are still there.
I'm here. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Mignolo and Dr. Walsh, for all of your thoughts and ideas throughout many years. And it is because of these thoughts and ideas that McConey and I wanted to create this handbook. So I'm going to actually share a PowerPoint with you. I know I did something last week, and this will probably be the last that you'll see of me kind of plugging this handbook. But the reason why we are wanting you all to hear about it is because we are still accepting some chapters. So we, Dr. McConey, along with myself and Lorato Mkwena, are compiling what we are calling the Rutledge Handbook of Language in the Global South. And really our intent is to take a lot of what Dr. Walsh and Dr. Mignolo were talking about, and this idea of expanding kind of whose voices are heard, whose voices are legitimized, what constitutes the Global South versus the Global North, and trying to kind of play with these ideas of disconnect All of these things we want to do within this handbook. And so the foreword will be written by Dr. Boaventura de Santos, who spoke last week. And the postscript will be written by Dr. Anna Dumer in South Africa. And the book has multiple themes that kind of we are looking at and playing around with. Again, some of these themes, might change, might grow, might expand based on your own ideas. But we are looking at histories, philosophies, and politics of the Global South. We're calling one theme toward multiple language ontologies and Southern multilingualisms, Southern as critical theories, language and peace building, refugees, immigrants, protest and security, land, sea, and nature, alternate epistemologies, indigenous epistemologies and indigenous languages, language, the Global South, and the family, or concepts of how the family might look and sound different in different contexts and epistemological, ontological spaces, language, gender, sex, and sexuality, language, labor, and mobility, Southern theory and social justice, race and language, critical race theories, and Southern theories. And so I think that these themes really, in multiple ways, connect to what has been talked about and discussed today. We are planning on having 30 to 35 chapters, perhaps more. And while we are no longer accepting abstracts, if you have a fully written paper that's around 6,000 words, so not very long, that you think would be a good fit into this, or if you know of a student, if you know of a non-academic, if you know of an activist that would like to kind of present their voice within this handbook, please send an email to the following email, handbookglobalsouth@gmail.com. Again, it's fairly short, 6,000 words inclusive of references. We are using APA format and it will be published through Routledge. But we are hoping that some of what was discussed today really is taken up both in theory and praxis within this handbook. So do you have any additional questions right now? And if not, feel free to email us. But any questions about the handbook before we move to the after party? Okay, well, please, again, just if you are interested, please send an email to handbookglobalsouth@gmail.com, or you can send an email directly to Dr. Makoni, and he can forward it to me and Lorato as well. But again, thank you so much, Dr. Mignolo and Dr. Walsh. And if you would like to be a part of the handbook as well, please, we would love your work. Thank you.
Great.
Hey, all right. Thanks a lot, Anna. So we are now, the keynote conference, the keynote lecture is over. We are in the after party now. So we are in some imaginary lobby of the hotel. And we just want to hang out with our guest speakers. So this is the section of the webinar we refer to as after party hours. We still have a couple of questions. It's rather informal. I would like to ask Desmond and Ted perhaps to pose their questions at this point in time. Kindly keep the questions brief so that we can take a few more. Desmond?
Thank you so much, Catherine and Walter, for this wonderful opportunity. And it's wonderful to meet everyone here. So some of you who were with us last week might remember me asking the question about the nation state. And I'm leaning on that question to ask this because it seems like this idea keeps coming back to our conversation. And there are a few ideas that both Dr. Mignolo and Dr. Walsh talked about here that I think are relevant to the question I'm asking. And some of this also is growing out of my current work that conceptualizes, coloniality, not just as systemic, but also as structural. And I see the nation state at the heart of that matrix. That is the power and ability of the nation state to use violence. Okay, and when I think of what Dr. Mignolo said regarding decoloniality as an option, I wonder if, one part of the exercise of that option is, to just maintain the current matrix of power for some people, not for everybody, but for some people. And to get back then to the question about, border crossing, the idea of moving from the north to the global south, which I consider such a powerful enactment of that idea. Is it really possible for us to ultimately get to that point where the order of existence in the world is no longer directly controlled or under the superintendency of the nation state, and I'll also say by extension, academic institutions or intellectual institutions, the way that you were conceptualizing this, Dr. Mignolo, not just universities, but the media and so forth, which I think have very clear aggressive hold on people's lives, and in many ways in destructive ends. There are many instances in which the work of decoloniality, in the ways that it's been done even before the academia took on that project, have been confronted with state violence or corporate violence. And my sense is that the structural element of coloniality does not accept these options. That is the option for people to be different. And whenever the exercise of those options come in contact or context with the nation state or with corporate politics and so forth, there is violence. And I wonder if there is any possibility for coexistence between, the structures of the nation state, global corporate capitalism, institutionalized structures of knowledge production in universities and elsewhere, and also this project of decoloniality? Or do we really have to look forward to a completely new era, a post-state, post-capitalist, post, university, world where people can begin to enact these existences? I can comment on this further if it is helpful, but I'm just wondering how much decoloniality is possible as a lived experience given the structures of power we have in place today.
So who would you like to respond? Either speaker?
This question is to both of you. Sorry for not clarifying that.
I can go. You want to take another question?
Oh, okay. All right. So there is a question from Ted, who regrettably is in a library and can't ask the question himself. So it's all about education. He's inviting a comment, and I think this may also be addressed to Catherine. He says, in Bolivia, with the Reform Education Act, requiring, for instance, that all Bolivians were supposed to learn both Spanish and Aymara, but in practice, this only applied to indigenous peoples and not the majority population, because they would go to the private American schools. So some contradiction there, which Ted would like a comment on. So perhaps we could take this.
Boss, it looks like Ted's saying his question is above that comment.
Beg your pardon?
Oh, there we go. He's reposted his actual question.
Oh, okay. So he's rephrased it. Thank you. So that's the very last comment he has on the chat box. It says, if various groups who offer fundamental and radically different ways of living always risk being co-opted or exterminated by the state, how might a coalitional anti-capitalist and decolonial politics be formulated at the global level across and between these groups against nation states, constitutions, and the hegemony of, say, for instance, the EU, the UN, and the IMF. Now, this is a powerful one. Is it possible to formulate a politics of refusal against citizenship in the traditional sense and a global redistribution of goods and care outside of the monetary developmentalist mode in loose networks of care? Or are we so entrenched globally in the system of political institutions of the state and the market that we cannot overcome it? So perhaps we could take this two for now. So the one, the previous one and this one from Ted.
So, but there were 3 questions or there are 2?
It does appear that the one on education on Bolivia, if you could just comment on it in passing, but it looks as if the questionnaire would like to focus on this last one.
But there is a question by Desmond.
Yes, there's a question by Desmond about how to go beyond the nation states.
Oh, that's you're reading. Okay, so
Yeah.
I go with that, and then Catherine can go with both. But
just to clarify, that question, is a follow-up to Catherine's commentary about Ecuador and the ways that the new constitution was eventually co-opted by the state. Just to clarify.
yeah, let me just make some kind of general point. But I want to start again insisting on the kind of the global south. Is the south of Europe part of the global south? Is the south of United States the land of the Confederate, the global south, the land of the Republican? I think that the global south is a kind of emerge when the third world disappears. And that I think that the global south hides more than reveals. But I think, again, the south of Europe is not the same as the south of Africa or the south of South America. You can theorize the global south from the global south of Europe, but that is a different kind of ball game that I think I have to pay attention to. So the question of Desmond, I think we are in the change of epoch or the change of era. And that is what I see as kind of the multipolarity and pluriversality. Now, the question of the state, long question. We are talking about the nation state, right? And the nation state has a problem that is very manifested now, and many problems, but one of the problems that has to do with the de-existence is that the nation state was created, one nation, one state. And refugees and immigrants are, and that is the kind of races kind of serve very well the politic of the state to keep the national. The state care for the national, not for the humanity. And the state care for the national rich, not for nature. So we have to, so the state is a problem and it's kind of coming into the end, but we have to live with it for a while. The second point I want to make, and somebody mentioned what I'm going to make now. There are 3 examples that we have to think about. What Jean Casimir called the beauty of the sovereign people in Haiti. The Haiti revolution was co-opted immediately by the kind of the minorities in kind of confabulation with the global. But for Casimir, the Haitian revolution is the people organize themselves around the LACU. The LACU is in Haiti like IU in the Andes. So that is one, and it's going on today. I mean, Casimir just published a wonderful book about the kind of decolonial history of Haiti, talking about that is the Haitian revolution. What is happening today that you don't see. The second is the Zapatistas. The Zapatistas said, we don't need the state, you keep it. We have better things to do. And the third example is Rojava, that somebody mentioned there. And Okalam, I mean, they have their own kind of theoretical thing. So I think we will coexist with the violence of the state, because the state doesn't like these kind of things, doesn't like people disobeying the state. But that's what I'm talking about. Today, kind of there are coexistence of three political trajectory. The desperate intent of the West to maintain the privilege. So the West today is in a counter-reformation. It's a counter-revolution. It's a counter-revolution because things are escaping their hand. On the one hand, because of China and Russia, but the other hand, the people are understanding more and more. So that coexistence between what we can call decoloniality at large, whether people think decolonially or not theoretically, they are kind of in their life, they began to realize that there is something that cannot stand anymore. So that's the coexistence, and this is the coexistence of these three trajectories that marks the change of epoch. Because the epoch of de-Westernization, unipolarity, universality, that is over. It's over, but it's not gone. So they were kind of keeping universality at the university, but also the UNESCO and the United Nations and the IMF, etc. Look what happened today, and I finish with that. It's not just us that are thinking about the future from the present of COVID. In the IMF, what Georgina is, the plan of Georgina is the great transformation. We have to take advantage of the crisis to help the kind of the underdeveloped nation to get out of the crisis. What does it mean? Debt. So what is the project of Davos? Are you paying attention to Davos? Where the kind of, in January, Davos, and there is a lot of information in the webpage, is the Great Reset. So they are not sleeping. And that is the West. IMF, Davos is the West. So the Great Reset is and the Great Transformation, they are not saying it, but you can see it. We have to confront the Road and Belt Initiative. China is taking too much space. So from the West, so the de-Westernization is confronted with the counter-revolution of re-Westernization, working together the IMF with Davos. And there is a web page where you can see Georgina talking with Schwab about the Great Reset and the Great Transformation. That is the change of era, and we have to be very, very aware. I mean, it's no longer that we would take the state and make the revolution. When Fanon was talking about decolonization, that was a different kind of context. We are no longer there. We can read a lot about Fanon, about Biko, from Biko, Cabral, etc., Lumumba, but we are in a different world, and we have to know what world are we living in terms of what are we going to do, what are our possibilities.
Okay, thank you.
So Bessie, can I follow up on that as well?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, sort of tying into what Walter said, but also the very clear questions as comments of both Desmond and Ted, I think lead us to different issues to bring up in the debate, in the reflections that we've been making today. I think it's important, Desmond, to think about the myth of nation state. That nation state really anywhere in the world no longer exists, if it ever did. But rather the denationalization and the transnationalization of state is part of the current moment. We're still led to believe that the nation state is there. The notion of left and right politics, party politics, is part of that, right? Of who to elect as the president of the nation, as if that person has sort of this individual power that's not transnationalized. So elections anywhere in the world today are really transnational elections. What's at stake, who's involved, who's behind the candidate, not just in terms of funding, something very clear in the US with the Trump campaign, but it's present everywhere in the world. So I think it's important, as Desmond suggests, to sort of dismantle, undo this myth of nation state, particularly in these current times, and to think about the ways that the nation state is being dismantled, right? That takes us beyond the old binary of left versus right. That's something that, particularly in Latin America, but certainly elsewhere, we've learned of so-called progressive presidents that represent a left perspective. But if we look at both their capitalist and colonial base and foundation, it continues on. So wide-scale extractivism, particularly in ancestral Black and indigenous territories, continues regardless of the left or right designation, as does de-existence. So, I mean, I think that's one point important to think about. But it's also to think about what are the prospects, what are the actions of the dismantling that are taking place, that have taken place, and are being retaken up in these current times. Certainly, both in Bolivia and Ecuador, the notion of a plurinational is key there, a plurination. Not necessarily taking over state. And that's sort of where the tension becomes. So in Ecuador, but also in Bolivia with Evo Morales, it's the same kind of thing. When one gets into state, into the power, to the structure of state, one assumes that structure, right? And oftentimes enables it to strengthen and not dismantle itself. So I think the notion that began in the 1920s in Bolivia and much more recently in Ecuador in the 70s, to think about the notion of the plural nation or the plurinational is a structure that has existed also in other places in the world. Certainly in different nations in Africa, particularly South Africa, the plurination is part of the debate, right? Part of a long history of debate about the problem of state, both the state in the situation of apartheid, but even post-apartheid, and sort of what happens today and the distinctions of those in townships and those in power, who may look the same physically, but also obviously have very different notions of how the society should be constructed. And that sort of ties to the long question that Ted had, with many different aspects. I think to begin to connect the ways that nation state and its myth and practice is being dismantled in different places of the world is crucial today. To enable us to think, I would say, not globally, because I think the notion of the global has also been co-opted and used in the wrong ways, but to begin to connect the fissures or cracks that I talked about. So one of those connections, particularly key, and that Ted alluded to in his question, was the relationship with Kurdistan. So if we think about Kurdistan as the territory that crosses a number of different so-called nation states, Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq being some, but Kurds are in many other places of the world, but continue to think of themselves not as a state. The central project of the Kurdish movement today is not a new state, but it's rather what sometimes Öcalan, one of their leaders, refers to, but also a collective notion of confederalism. Not confederate, like in the case of the United States, but rather the connection that crosses borders, that crosses territories, that doesn't require a geographic unification necessarily, but an agreement or a shared way of identification and of being that's particularly key. The relationships today between the debates around Kurdistan and the Kurdish movement and Latin America are actively taking place. So here in Latin America, typically we have a representative of the Kurdish movement who moves from Latin American countries out in continuous conversation, not with government, not with state, but with communities, trying to work in this rethinking of what society might look like without the myth of nation state that's been maintained for so many years. Those kinds of connections are extremely interesting. So one could say that the context of Kurdish people is radically distinct from the context of many indigenous and Black communities and collectives in Latin America, yet those dialogues are taking place. And so the notion of the plurinational and the notion of confederalism both have this aim of rethinking the very notion of democracy, right? The notion of democracy, which again is sort of this Western concept that's been applied throughout the world, and to rethink it in different words, in different terms, in different languages, and in different practices is taking place. So I think those kinds of connections enable what Ted referred to in his question, a kind of politics of refusal, right? But also beginning to build what the decolonial feminist Maria Lugones called coalition politics, right? About how we build across differences, across geographic location, but in a shared kind of project that doesn't collapse into one, but recognizes the differences. I think that's particularly key today. Not to solidify or continue to fight for the nation state and its myth, but to recognize its transnationalization, to recognize the limitation of electoral politics as they're set up today in the world, and to begin to think of other ways, both of social governance that enables different kinds of relations and different kinds of decision-making to take place. Even to think about assembly kind of decision-making versus electoral decision-making. That doesn't mean that we negate the importance of a difference of getting Trump out of power in the US, for example. Of course that was necessary. But the issue is not that Biden is going to save or begin to build a different project. No, because the state is transnational. It's already set up that way, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is the kind of coalition politics that is taking place and that needs to be strengthened, for me, is the road to go today. And it works basically to begin to dismantle nation state and to construct other ways of governance, of decision-making, of building a social collective that enables maybe at some point in time, but even I would say that exists today in those fissures and cracks, a kind of decolonial project. It's not necessarily one that we always need to put the decolonial as the adjective of description, but rather to look at what's going on. The decolonial happens. It doesn't always have to be named. It's not the new root. It's not that some are more decolonial than others, right? And that they have to sort of raise their decolonial flag. It's not about that. It's about beginning to think together, maybe as we're beginning to think together here, at least on screen and from different places in the world, of what needs to be done, what is being done, and how we begin to connect those threads and to sort of weave new possibilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. The owners of the hotel lobby where we are now are already telling us that we need to. So I would crave the audience to take just two very short questions from Brett and Shanice, and thereafter I'd request Sinfree to summarize the evening or the morning for us. So Brett.
Hi, so thanks for letting me talk. I wanted to take us pretty far back in time. And my question was prompted by something that Walter was talking about. But of course, Catherine, you're also welcome to chime in if you want to. First thing I wanted to say was thanks for mentioning Gloria Anzaldua's work. I also had a sort of similar experience to you because, you know, my last name is Diaz. I'm from Southern California. My family, both of my grandparent generation families come from immigrants, one from Cuba and Spain, one from France and Quebec. And so I also learned a lot about myself reading Anzaldúa in a place where understandings about language and linguistic identity inform how you are thought to be Chicano or how you are thought to be Latino or whatever. So I very much appreciate that reference. And what I wanted to ask you about, Walter, is drawing more on your semiotics background and where it intersects with Marxism and class understanding, is how can we use the historical material in our culture, in our places, to break apart from these sort of second order issues, such as color, for example, to see the issue of class and commodification, objectification, and exploitation, so that we can find those, as you said, borders, and Catherine, as you said, the cracks, to show how people are together and to be less drawn to these physical manifestations, if you will, of class that actually make it more difficult to renew and to sew together the causes that we have. And so, yeah, I would be really interested to see how your thoughts on semiotics and historical materials can kind of come together to accomplish that.
Walter, you have the floor.
Yeah, I was just trying to unmute myself. I think that, but I mean, let's just start from what Catherine left off. Yeah, I think what, I think it clarifies what Catherine said, that the state, the myth of the state will stay with us for a while. But the state clearly is being dismantled by, yeah, the concept of plurinational is very important in the sense that the concept of the state was uninational. So that is kind of the plurinational kind of goes together with pluriversality and the kind of explosion of universality. On the other hand, the state is taken by the corporation. So the question, I think, is I want to relate that with Ted's intervention in the following way. There is something that Louis Gordon, a Jamaican philosopher, said a while ago, but that I think is a kind of a starting point. He said, the Americas smells like race. Europe smells like class. So the question is that what Marx was sensing, looking, seeing, they were kind of right, the exploitation of the proletarian. But who were the proletarian? They were not African, they were not Asian, they were not Latin American. The proletarian were white, male, Christian, Protestant, perhaps. But in order to get to the class, you have to go through 2.5 centuries of racism in relation to the formation of capitalism, of the kind of exploitation of labor, and I come back here to the kind of de-existence. Because one of the kind of key consequences of racism in the exploitation of labor and the expropriation of land was making human life disposable. Never in the history of humanities, life was disposable. There were slaves in Greece, there were slaves in Europe, but they were not disposable. And what does it mean to make the life disposable? That slaves were just a commodity in the kind of the new economy. And what you do with commodities, you use it and then you throw it away, right? So 450 years later, the nation state is in place. And there is another concept that emerged there that Hannah Arendt put it forward, bare life, and then Agamben took it over. So this is very interesting to see the question of race and class together, and connect the kind of the Holocaust with the kind of the Holocaust of the slavery, because disposable and bare life today comes together in the nation state to kind of eliminate immigrants and to eliminate refugees. So the question is, and again, Quijano makes race, not class, the fundamental question, the fundamental axis of the colonial matrix of power. And he has another concept that is crucial here. It's not class, it's classification. So coloniality is a machine of maintaining classification to kind of, so class is part of the classification, but it's not the kind of the central piece of classification. And when we realize that there is no outside of the colonial matrix of power. The question is, look at yourself. Where have you been placed in the colonial matrix of power? Because the question of identity is not who you are. The question of identity, and Fanon said it another way, instead of talking about classification, Fanon talked about sociogenesis. And what sociogenesis is? See, well, he knew that he has black skin. He didn't know that he was a Negro, because a Negro is something else than having black skin. It's a kind of classification, racial classification. So for me, and Saldúa began to unpack all this kind of thing mixed together with the question of sexuality. And since Ansaldúa comes into the debate in the United States when white feminism was taking over, and that is why kind of Lugones entered into the debate, was crucial for me because it showed me, made me feel how kind of classification, racial classification, sexual classification, work together to kind of destitute people. And the task now for me, the decolonial, is the kind of reconstitution. Reconstitution to restitute what has been destituted. So that is a very complex question, but the main point is, again, classification and being aware of what has been classified and how can we work from there. And that is what we were talking about, that you cannot change the world if people who are in the world don't change. And so decoloniality starts by yourself. I cannot tell you how to decolonize. That is your problem. You have to find out how to do it. But again, coalition is fundamental.
Thank you very much. Shines, next.
Hello, hi. Sorry. Hey, thank you very much for your talks. I've really enjoyed this. I just wanted to ask, about education and the practice of education in light of everything that you both are saying, because I think what interests me is that I feel like in the theoretical discussions or the intellectual kind of debates, we say many different words, but we often mean the same things. You know, like oftentimes I think we're very, not universally, but oftentimes we similarly want to be anti-racist. You know, we want to conduct research in a certain way. I'm very interested in how do we teach this, you know, like how do we bring that into the classroom and spread the message, you know, because especially if we're based in the university where we get a lot of, and to be honest with you, I'm a PhD student, I haven't actually taught yet, but I just, I remember something you said, Profe Mignolo, in a talk you did earlier on, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, you said, you know, we cannot decolonize the university, but we can do decolonial work in the university. And you said about a key part of that is the hundreds of students who pass through. And it would be interesting, I think, to think about what can we do and to kind of create a conversation about how we act within the university, which we know is this colonial institution, in order to encourage students to think in some of the ways that everybody has been thinking and speaking today. Like, it's very inspirational. How can we spread the messages, you know?
So since Kathy has much more experience in pedagogical question, I kind of go first and let Kathy kind of take the last word. In the class I mentioned, the Maya, Aztec, Incas, I don't mention coloniality and I don't mention decoloniality. I know it. We discuss it here. I discuss that with the graduate student because they come to Ghana. But with the undergraduate student, no, I just show them. And little by little, toward the end, they began to read coloniality, decoloniality, not a scholarly article, conversation, report and inform, but just kind of voices of indigenous people who talk about the colonialism. So the question is that this discussion is between us. The second question is, how do we manage to kind of take that into people who are 18, 22? You cannot start from kind of the concept because they kind of abandon the class. You have to get it. So the second point is that, the second point I make in the class is that racism is not a problem of racialized person. The problem is the people who racialize. So we are all involved in racism. Like it or not, the question is, where have you been placed in the kind of the racial matrix? So, and then how you do that? You don't do that to transmitting information. You have to manage to engage the student in conversation among themselves. They prepare conversation and they come to class. I teach the first two classes and then I kind of make comment. So the question of conversation is fundamental. We cannot decolonize the university soon because the university is either related to the state or to the corporation. And the state is related to the corporation, so they have a different needs. They have to train students. They have to train a student to be efficient worker into the machine. So I think that it's important to do this decolonial work. I mean, a lot of people criticize me because I am a Duke. So how can you be decolonial at Duke? Well, I had to go to the mountain. What do I have to do? I had to go to do decolonial. There are, as I said, there are many students who, and the other colleagues too. So the question is to do at the university, to create this kind of conversation that are parallel to other conversations that the example I gave is, because the question is education and not just the university. The education is in life. What do? With what people we talk, what kind of comment we make. So the question of Haiti, how the people in Haiti survive in the LACU, because they transmitted generation through generation that kind of education. There are many other examples. I mean, the Rojava again, I mean, the Kurd. The Rojava is more complex than the Zapatistas, because the Zapatistas have to deal, with Mexico, but the Rojava, as Kathy said, I mean, they are in between Kurds, Syrian, Iran, etc. But there is something else that is going on in outside of the university, that we have to use the university. And this is my final comment. Let's use the university, the internet, whatever we need, we can, and not let the university and the internet use us. So that is the concept of kind of disobeying and kind of delinking. And that can be done not by transmitting information and theoretical discussion. That has to be done creating conversation. Conversation is what produces mutual transformation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, to sort of weave with Walter, let's start with Rojava, with what is going on in terms of education, in a project that's women-led. So that I think is a key element today, in terms of the rethinking and the redoing that we're talking about here. Who's leading, and how are they leading, and with whom? So the fact that the process of Rojava, as is what is today is called the Kurdish communities of women, is leading a project where education is not the institution of schooling as we've been taught to believe it, but it's rather creating communities of knowing, of thinking, of existing together, where the issue of care, of not, and I'm not thinking that it's only because we're women that we do this kind of caring as a pedagogy. No, but rather to think about how does one construct processes of education that are radically distinct, right? And how do they exist in places we call schools, but also in places we call universities? So I think that the ways that those are taking form in Rojava, but also the ways that they've taken form in Zapatista communities are extremely key, because they break the notion of institutionalized education or formal schooling, right? Also the notion that the women of Rojava have introduced of thinking a new social science. So what's called gynology, which is a science of women, that's a science of life and existence that's being taught both in schools, but also in the universities, the new universities taking form in Rojava, but also in spaces in Turkey and Syria, in Iran, Iraq, thinking a new kind of social science that's thought from the perspective of women, I think is extremely key, right? It sort of makes me recall the work of bell hooks. When bell hooks talked about a number of years ago, the ways that teaching necessarily marks caring and love, and how those are so seldom present in most classrooms, worse yet at the university level. So what does it mean to create a context in the classroom of love and care and of safety, where people feel that they can talk honestly about their own feelings, bring up the tensions that may even exist in the group in the classroom, and begin to process them, yes, in conversation, like Walter says. But I think that doesn't just happen in any classroom. One has to create, Shanice, the environment, the sense that it's safe, that we're watching each other's back, and that we're taking care of one another. And that means as teacher as well. I'm not just talking about students. It's also to sort of take a step down from that notion of the teacher, or worse yet in the university, of the professor. I always say and this isn't just a sort of a statement, but it's part of my own being and teaching pedagogically. I'm not an academic. Yes, I work in the university. I've worked in the university for 40 years, but I don't identify as an academic. That structure of academia is not what defines me, and it's not what gives me the impetus of what I understand as sort of pedagogical praxis that can take place in the classroom, but takes place in other places as well. And so I think those kinds of creating that environment, and as Walter well knows, in the doctoral program that we built in Ecuador, that's part of the notion. I mean, what does it mean to set up this environment where actually we even have food and coffee and drinks and whatever we need to give force to our body as we're thinking, but also one another. How do we share? How do we begin to build a kind of collective notion of caring about one another? That doesn't mean harmony. It doesn't mean we're all the same. It doesn't mean we get along, but it means that we can put issues on the table and critically address them. So I think going back certainly to the work of bell hooks, but also looking at other ways that issues of love and caring are part of real teaching, and teaching not as transmitting knowledge and information, but rather building together a space where we begin this kind of interchange of sharing, where thinking is built. So thinking as being not just in an individual sense, but in the existence, the shared existence of a classroom space, but increasingly outside the classroom as well. So what sometimes we refer to as decolonial pedagogies are those that don't happen and are not limited to a certain space, but those processes where together in collective, we begin to create other possibilities of thinking, of sensing, of feeling, of being, and of doing, that question and that put in tension the dominant order, including the dominant order that universities continue to maintain. So Shanice, that's sort of my reflection on this, that it's very much in the doing, that there's no manual to follow. Certainly there are many examples, not to say that they're all by women, but oftentimes women, and I think, lead those examples. But I'm not excluding Walter, because I know Walter's classrooms are spaces of caring and loving conversation as well, right? But it's how do we create this different way of thinking about what teaching is about, right? And teaching as thinking, as being, as coexisting, but also of creating. So that's sort of my sense of the urgency of the work to be done. That Shanice, you may not be in the classroom yet, but think about the other spaces that you're in, where those kinds of pedagogies take place, and that are important to continue to strengthen and learn from. To me, the notion of planting seeds is essential. That the idea is not to reform the minds of our students, or those that we work with, or those that we work with in collective or social movement, but rather to think about the seeds. What are the seeds that we can plant? What are the seeds that have been handed down to us? What are the seeds that are out there that can be taken care of, that can maybe germinate, cultivate, and how do we assure that they grow? Not just in our classroom spaces, but in life in general. And I think that's what we need today, to think about those seeds and to think about their cultivation.
What a wonderful place to round up at this point. So much has been planted by way of seeds over the past 2.5 hours. And the tall order is sin freeze now to summarize the seeds that have been planted and send us to our respective homes. Seyfried?
Yes. Thank you very much, Catherine and Walter, and thank you to everybody for participating. I only have two things to say, which I think are related to this discussion. What I learned from this conversation was that everybody, irrespective of race, class, or ethnicity, is affected in one way or other by issues of coloniality. So if that proposition is a valid one, then issues about decoloniality should be of interest to most people, because decoloniality then provides you with a way of thinking about how coloniality has an impact on you. Now, if I then shift and start thinking as an applied linguist, what is the relevance of this? What are the questions that I ask? The questions that I then don't want to ask are questions like, oh, what is decoloniality, et cetera, et cetera. That is not the question that I would like to ask. The question I would like then to ask is, what is the impact of coloniality or decoloniality on the nature and type of applied linguistics that I do? So I shift from being preoccupied with providing definitions of decoloniality to being more interested in thinking about the impact decoloniality or coloniality has on the nature and type of discipline that I'm engaged with. That I think is my summary of the discussion. Although I would have liked to hear what Ophelia Garcia thinks, you've been very quiet. Oh, you don't want to talk?
Been free, and thank you, of course, Walter and Catherine. It's wonderful to see you after these many years in a different place. But I think that this is all related to language, of course, because coloniality has gone through language, and the way in which we think about language and teaching languages is certainly impregnated by coloniality.
Coloniality, yes, yes. Right. So in a way, then, you see, since the way we think about coloniality is influenced by language, then decolonizing language and linguistics as the discipline, one of the disciplines that deals with language, becomes an important and urgent issue. And from my perspective, some of the theoretical models in linguistics or applied linguistics, which are grounded in what Mignolo would call a universal speaking subject, don't capture the experiences that I think are relevant and which should be centralized in how we should be thinking about language. Right? Because how you think about language has an impact on how you are going to be handling issues about the nation state, issues about literature, issues about semiotics, etc. Right.
Can I say something, because this is a question very kind of great interest. To talk about language, we don't need linguistics.
Yes, we don't need linguistics. You could say, in actual fact, linguistics provides one way of talking about language, but that is not necessarily perhaps the most fruitful or productive way of thinking and talking about language. Right? That you would argue seriously that linguistics has taken us into a blind alley in terms of thinking about language. Right? Okay.
Well, thank you once again to everyone for... Oh, sorry. Walter, did you want to say something?
I thought I was talking.
Sorry, please go ahead.
No, but apparently you were not listening. I mean, you were not hearing. You were not hearing. No, I mean, one of the first books that we published as a group, Kathy was one of the editor. To indisciplining the social life. So decoloniality is an undisciplinary way of thinking.
Yes.
And the problem with the discipline is that they force you, that is coloniality, to confuse what you explain with a form of explanation.
Yes.
So that is why we kind of had to think seriously about that, because linguistic of any discipline, sociology, anthropology, etc., already trap us, kind of regulate our way of thinking. So that is why decoloniality is undisciplining. We use a way of kind of documenting, arguing, etc. But Kathy said that she's not an academic, and I am seeing people say my training is in semiotics, but I am not kind of acting as a semiotician, because yes, semiotic kind of orient me in some way, but I am not trying to do research to advance semiotics, but I do, or transform semiotic. I do research because knowing is thinking and thinking is living. And as a philosopher, Rodolfo Kusch said in Argentina, we don't know, we know, how he say? We know in order to live, not, and he was a philosopher, not in order to kind of transform philosophy or kind of improve philosophy. So I think that there is a decolonial way of thinking about how disciplines are entrenched with coloniality, the same like the state.
Yes, the point I was trying to make, if I try to articulate it more sort of in a more robust way, is to say that linguistics constitutes one way of thinking about language. But whether, for example, that is the most productive or most useful way of thinking about language for one's purposes is an open question. The second issue is that I believe that there are many more, there are infinite ways of thinking and talking about language, for example, which have not yet been brought to the fore, which cannot be incorporated in contemporary linguistic thinking, right? So what I'm interested in, for example, personally, are the other alternative ways of thinking about language, etc., which may draw their inspiration, whether from land, from water, or from skyscapes, etc., right? Because of what I think are the inherent limitations in the objectives of linguistics. Right.
Yeah, well, that is a big, big issue, but I think we kind of frame the problems that are involved in that.
Yeah, good. Yes. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you very much. This has been fascinating stuff. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been fantastic.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
And there is a lot of questions pending, but I mean, life is long, I hope.